Morning. There we go. Can you hear me? Good. Hope so anyway. All right. Happy Sabbath, and welcome to the Fullerton Seventh-day Adventist Church Adult Sabbath School class. Boy, that's a mouthful. Well, August 10th already. Man, I don't know. Every time it just seems to go by faster. You know, they say, as you get older, you notice it moving faster, and it sure does seem like that. All right, well, we got a good lesson this week, I think. It's very interesting. There's some good stuff, so let's go ahead and just start with prayer, and then we'll dive in. Father God, we are, again, humbled to be here in your presence, to worship you, to honor you, to learn about you. May your Spirit speak through me and teach us all that your love conquers all, that you are in all the things that we do and that we need. And we just ask you for your blessing. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right, lesson number 6, Inside Out. I like that title. But it's kind of an interesting, when you think about inside out, it has that kind of that play going on where you're talking about the inside, but then all of a sudden talking about the outside, right? And, in working on this lesson, I was kind of thinking how there's a lot of times we say things that are just kind of, they're not understood the way we meant them to be understood. You can notice that in our society, especially now, how many people have, I don't know if it's not tweeted anymore now, I don't know what it is with X, but did they X'd? But they, anything you say doesn't necessarily mean that's how you take it, but by the way that your words are understood. So you can mean one thing and people can understand a different thing. And I think that's somewhat kind of what this lesson is bringing out. And, when it comes to words, you can interpret them differently. Sometimes they have different meanings. Sometimes they can have the same meaning and still mean something different. So, for example, I want to put a couple up on the screen, if I can, hopefully. You got that slide, the text? Yeah, thank you. There it is. These are a couple of titles that were in newspaper type things, at least at one point. So you have Survivor of Siamese Twins Joins Parents. Now, you could take that to mean, obviously, that it survived, the Siamese twins survived and was just, enjoying its time now being with the parents. But you could also take that to mean that the one surviving twin has now been joined to the parent, like surgically. And then the other one, you have juvenile court to try shooting defendant. And that might work, but it goes against the law a little bit, but because depending on how you look at it, it's either they can try shooting, as in, taking a gun and shooting the defendant, or they can actually just try him in a trial for being a shooting suspect. So again, you can see how the words can be the exact same words and yet have different understandings. There's a book I heard about called The Most Dangerous Game. Excuse me. It's about a hunter who mastered the art of the chase and craves a new challenge, And so, of course, the idea of the game that they're talking about, the most dangerous game is an animal hunted for sport. So, of course, you would think of the most dangerous animal. But, of course, on the other hand, game can also be things that we play, chance, skill games, board games. And so if if your life depended on a match, that also could be a very most dangerous game. So again, we have many things in our language that makes it very difficult to sometimes understand what's going on. And I was just thinking how I think a lot in the stories we're going to be reading, there's a lot where Jesus is pointing out that the disciples' view, the Pharisees' view, the world's view took things wrong. They weren't looking at it correctly. They had the same words, the same understanding in many ways, but they just took it in the wrong way and weren't seeing the true nature of it. So we'll get into that as we go. But of course, when I heard this title, I immediately jumped to that Disney movie, Inside Out. I don't know if you have ever seen that. It's a more kid thing. Of course, I have young niece and nephews, so I have seen it. It's cute. It has basically this idea of showing how people's emotions, can control them and help guide their actions and such. And so I want to just show you a little clip just to give you an idea, because I think it'll help us kind of get a picture of this inside-out idea. Dean, if you could.
So, Riley, how was the first day of school?
Fine, I guess.
Did you guys pick up on that?
Sure did.
Something's wrong. Signal the husband.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What is it, woman? What?
All right, as you can see, the idea is inside us. We sometimes have, now in that movie it's just emotions, but I think in some ways we can relate. It's not really what we have inside us, but we still have these thoughts and things that are going on in our head that make us think things and feel things and do things. And this lesson is all about how those inner things present themselves on the outward actions. And so I just thought we kind of use that as an idea to open this up. So our memory text: there is nothing that enters a man from the outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. Mark 7:15. So this week's study is going to be on Mark 7 and the first half of Mark 8. And at the beginning of 7, Jesus is stirring up more controversy. There's a lot of that in this Mark. Then again, there's quite a bit of that in most of the Gospels. But he's going to stir it by his rejection of religious tradition. Boy, that is something that will get you in trouble sooner than anything else just about. If you decide to go against the religious tradition that people are really, really pushing for, it can be amazing how much we fight back at that. And so, Jesus, of course, is going to have something more deeply relevant to the Christian life that we're going to study. So as we move into Sunday's lesson, human traditions versus God's commands. And would someone read, let's hear, Mark 7, 1 through 13, please.
One day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to confront Jesus. They noticed that some of Jesus' disciples failed to follow the usual ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they have poured water over their cupped hands, as required by their ancient traditions. Similarly, they eat nothing bought from the market unless they have immersed their hands in water. This is but one of many traditions they have clung to, such as the ceremony of washing cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of religious law ask him, "Why don't your disciples follow the age-old customs, where they eat without first performing the hand-washing ceremony?" Jesus replied, "You hypocrites! Isaiah was prophesied about you when he said, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away. They worship in farce is a farce, for they replace God's commands with their own man-made teachings. For you ignore God's specific laws and substitute your own traditions.' Then he said, 'You reject God's law in order to hold on to your own traditions. For instance, Moses gave you the law from God. Honor your father and mother, and anyone who speaks evil of father or mother must be put to death. But you say it is all right for people to say to their parents, 'Sorry, I can't help you,' for I have vowed to give to God what I've given to you. So let them disregard their needy parents. As such, you break the law of God in order to protect your own tradition. And this is only one example. There are many, many others."
I like how he puts that in there at the end a little bit. There's many, many others too. It wasn't just this one. Now, obviously, by just first glance reading, some people would take and read this and go, "Wow, Jesus doesn't care if we wash our hands." Hygiene isn't important. Obviously, I don't think that is what is being said here, right? So that's why, again, I said we sometimes have words where we can take them one way, but if we don't look at the context, if we don't open them up and study it more, we might not get the true meaning of what is being said. So, what is being said?
He was talking about their ceremonial law.
Right, you picked up on that little clip in there where he says, the ritual washing, right? There's different things that they had set up from Moses that they were supposed to do, but of course they kind of added on to that over time. Now, let me ask you this though. So is it important then to separate the difference between like hygiene clean, healthy clean, and defilement clean? Are they different? Is there a difference between defilement like in doing wrong, being bad, being made to do bad even, versus your physical environment, the things you do that are healthy, not getting germs, that type of thing? Is it important to make a distinction between those two? Or are they partly the same thing?
Last week we talked about the word unclean a lot in our lesson study because as Jesus arrived off the lake, there were unclean evil spirits. It wasn't just evil spirits. These were unclean. In an unclean land, it was a Gentile, and the Jewish people that were there were borderline. They owned a herd of pigs that was numerous. And he was an unclean man because he was demon-possessed. So everything was unclean. But in the sense that Jesus even attacked that, let alone being unclean, because the scribes have come up with a new tradition about 200 years earlier that you had to just wash, because everybody was a kingdom of priests. And you can see their logic, where if everybody's a kingdom of priests now, not just Leviticals, then everybody should wash. And that's where the tradition came from. But again, it was a tradition of the Jewish people were real concerned about even associating with the unclean. And they, in many ways, hoped that would bring God back into their kingdom, into their lives. And so this idea of being unclean as a tradition, it was pretty strong because that was their way back to God's graces.
Exactly. And so I think we have this situation where it's very important to have a difference between things that are, just good hygiene, good things to do, safe things to do, and things that are spiritually or morally detrimental. There's a difference between those, and yet even then, it's important to realize, and we'll be getting into that more, of where that comes from and what it's being done for. Because even though the washing wasn't necessarily done for, in this case, wasn't done as much to be clean as it was to be ceremonial clean, it still has a certain effect on people, because it basically makes you get this idea that I can look at someone, I can do things, and what they do may cause me to become a sinner. Somehow something they are, something about them, in their presence, there is something that can come and affect me. And I think we have to really make a difference between that.
Yes. I think we need to be careful to distinguish between God's moral law and ceremonial laws. God's moral law
Very good.
takes precedent, and the ceremonial laws, many are done away with.
Right, and so one of the ceremonial laws, part of it comes from Exodus 30, 17 through 21, and I'll just read that real quick. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "You shall also make a laver of bronze, and with its base also a bronze for washing. You shall put in it between the tabernacle of meeting and the altar. You shall put water in it. For Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet in the water from it, when they go into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister, to burn an offering made by fire to the Lord. They shall wash with water, lest they die. So they shall wash their hands and their feet, lest they die, and it shall be a statute forever to them, to him and his descendants throughout their generations. So obviously, some serious stuff. I mean, it's not like they just came out of some of this kind of with the blue of like, I think we should just wash. There's wash or die wording on this. But if they had looked a little closer, it is limited to certain situations and to a certain group of people. And I think when I was going over this lesson, it's interesting how Jesus doesn't always answer questions directly, at least not the way he's asked them, because he kind of just goes in a different direction with this. He could have given them a direct answer and said, here's the response to what you're saying, but what do you think would have happened had he done that? Why do you think he sometimes doesn't give an immediate response of directly to what they're saying, instead moves it in a different direction?
Oftentimes, if you argue with somebody, they get even more buried in their side of the argument. And
Yes.
do not listen. Whereas if he just changes things up and uses examples, almost like a parable in a way, he can oftentimes hope to get through to their minds and hearts what the point really is, and not what not the problem of washing or not washing. It's the problem of the hypocrisy and the traditions that usurp commandments that he was concerned about.
Right. And I think it goes along with his ability to also, he sometimes uses questions, and sometimes both the questions and just diverting the topic into a different direction. And I like what you said there. I think when you're dealing with people, sometimes if you fit their expectation, you're not going to reach them, because they already have you. Think about for yourself. If you go up to someone, you see how they're dressed, you see how they act, you're immediately starting to put a mask on them. You're saying, okay, here's what I know about them. They're going to be like this. Their responses are going to be something like this. And you just immediately get in that. And as long as they fulfill what you're desiring from that person, you're going to think exactly the same thing. You're not going to really try to think deeper about that person, because you've already got a mental picture of who they are. You don't want to use that time when, hey, I've already got the answer I need. And I think especially the way you hear them talk, they were trying to trap Jesus. They're trying to ask him things that are, purposefully to rile him up. So they had the answers they wanted. They knew what they wanted him to respond, and they knew how they wanted to respond to that. They had it all laid out. And so instead of fulfilling their desire, and like you said, making it just basically creating a even stronger wall, he throws in a wrench in there, and all of a sudden wait a minute, wait, that wasn't the response we were looking for. That's not what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to answer us, which I'm pretty sure most other of their people would have probably felt the need to answer them. They were religious leaders, so if they ask you a question, you don't just, well, let me ask you a question. You just give an answer. And so, go ahead.
I think when he points out about honor your father and mother, I thought that was very specific. He said, here you have your traditions, which violate the fifth commandment. And, well, we're going to give our money to the church instead of our parents. We'll let them go hungry. But then they didn't even give the money to the church. They could do with it what they wanted, as long as their intent was they said that. I thought that was crazy.
Oh, yes, that is, he really brings up a really good one with that, because when it comes to your parents, for one thing, you don't have much excuse. It's really hard to come about it and say, unless you had really, really bad parents somehow, it'd be very hard for you to say that, they don't need my help. I shouldn't care about them. There's just, when it comes to parents, that's not one you're going to get over easily. And so, the very fact that this was a problem and that he brings it up would have been something that would have immediately, I think, hit in their heart. They would have known, like, oh, he caught that one. We thought we had it, they really thought they had it kind of, legally sealed up, because, well, it's given to God. I'm sorry, I gave it to God. I can't help you. My parents, I want to, but, it's for God. Amazing how much we like to blame God for things in many senses. Because isn't that what it's doing? As much as you might be thinking, oh, I'm doing this for God, yay, No, you're doing it mostly for yourself, and you're even placing the blame on God that way. You're saying, oh, it's God's fault that I'm doing this. And have you thought about another time when, well, there's been many, but one of the first times blame was placed on God? Do you remember? There was...
You created her. Well, you created the serpent.
Yes, exactly. And the beauty of it is, because Adam, when he says it, Adam, why did you say that? When I read it, I just like, like, well, the woman you made for me made me do it. Come on, he both places the blame not on the woman only, but on God. It's amazing how we love to change things around a little bit. We even do that now when it's, when bad things are happening to us. Well, it's an act of God. We like to throw in things like that. And it doesn't mean that God doesn't have things that are actions, but not everything is meant to be, some type of punishment from God or some, guilty thing. It's amazing how much we don't consider our actions, how they relate to what God is doing. And I want to ask this question here. Hang on.
I wonder, while you're looking,
go ahead.
point out another example of what you just said that you made me think of, and that has to do with the law of God. Because after all, the law of God makes us legalistic instead of just letting us do what we know is right because we're good people, because we go to church and we worship you. We don't need the law. And that goes clear back to when Satan, Lucifer was saying in the first place. And that argument is still there, but it's God's fault because that law tends to make you legalistic.
Yeah, it's amazing how that works, isn't it? That is very true. And we do that throughout things, both in our everyday life and in the spiritual life here, as you said. That is a great example of that. And I unfortunately can't say I haven't done things similar to that over the years. I think it's just part of human nature. When something isn't quite the way we want, we like to redirect the blame a little bit. Share the blame. Share the wealth, share the blame, right? Except we don't want to share the wealth. So Jesus was quoting about the honoring with their lips. So I'm going to read that. That's from Isaiah 29, verse 13. Therefore the Lord said, inasmuch as these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. So that's what Jesus was quoting. That's a pretty powerful statement when I read it. It really makes me think, because there's a lot of that at times I have done certain things like that. It's easy to get into that mode. Amazing how much your mouth can do that you don't back up with the rest of your being. Now, when it comes to the commandment that he quotes then with that, of honor your father and mother, I think it's interesting how so often, as I've gone through I was raised Adventist, so I've heard a lot of the stories since as long as I can remember. And it was often done that honor the father and mother is a child's commandment, in a sense. It's not just that, I know, and people would say more than that, but it still often gets put down to, oh yeah, children, you should obey your parents. But I like how in this it's already brought out. This is also an adult command. This is something that was, and in some ways I think is almost more important as an adult command than as a child command. None of the other commandments are necessarily, they can be for children too, but most of them are going to be much more adult-oriented. Adultery, some of those things are a little bit more that way. And so I think to just say that one's, God somehow throwing in a little bit of a kid element into his thing, is just kind of ridiculous when we think of it that way.
I think the point there is, as children, we are to honor and obey our parents, as long as we have good parents and they don't crisscross God's law. And then as they take care of us when we're young, it's our responsibility to take care of them when they're old.
Right. And I think it can apply even more than just to our fallen state. I think it's something that should be inherent to any being that has been birthed by something else, been made by something else. Those that put the effort into raising you, to making you, whether they did good or bad, their effort still should apply to something. It has a value. And I've noticed, I mean, we can see it now when you look at how many, I remember my friends, they're like, man, when I get up, when I get 18, I'm out of here. My parents are driving me crazy. I'm out of here. They don't know what they're talking about, and the sooner you can dump them, the better. It was basically the thinking for many of them. Now, I love my parents, so that wasn't an issue for me, but, I've seen many people that way, and there are still people that, as you get to be an adult, it's one thing as a kid, even if you want to disobey your parent, you almost have to follow. And so it's not until you become an adult where you can actually cut off your parents to a high degree that way. Now, we do have certain legal aspects for kids, but that's a whole other topic. But I think it's interesting that we have this understanding of following I think it's more than just parents too in some ways. It's our elders, it's those that raised you. It's honoring God. He is our Father. It's another form of adoption through, Father. And I think it's important that we have this ability to respect those that have made you, basically. And I think it's personally, I think it's a really interesting commandment because in some ways it links the first part of the law to the last part. It's the human element that connects between the two. It's fascinating. Even the fourth commandment, that one's still more about God. It's not really about, it's what we do and such, but it's very much still God-oriented, but it's that family one that connects with that one. Those two really join and create this sense of God and man have a purpose together, and we need to put these things as a whole. And I know some people like to keep it, well, these are the things you do for God, and these are the things you do for man, But the reality is, this is one law. You break one, you've broken them all. But I'm getting a little off of topic here, so I just wanted to point out, though, again, that we have to be careful about blaming others. And I think it's something that's just natural to humans. And another thing that's natural is we don't like to take responsibility. I think that's partly why we blame. What's the point of blaming someone if it doesn't get you something? So it's almost like it's a type of being selfish. I don't want to take responsibility for this because it's not all my fault, and I don't want to be punished as much as everyone else, so I'm going to divert the blame a little bit. And that's just a type of selfish act.
Real quickly, one of the other things that hit me on this was that Jesus was not condemning traditions. He was condemning those traditions that replace or take precedence over God's law. And I had not really, until this study, read it that way before. Oh, traditions, men's traditions, church replacing. He wasn't doing away with that. As a matter of fact, one of his first miracles was at the wedding.
Exactly.
Which is very much a tradition in the Jewish weddings.
It's also him honoring his mother. He didn't want to do it. He actually, so one of the very first things he did was both honor the Sabbath and then honor his mother. Now, as you were pointing out, though, with that, we have to keep in mind that, it's not that he's tearing apart and saying the Bible's wrong here. He doesn't say that at all. In fact, he uses the Bible to support what he's saying, and he's pointing out to them how their view has perverted what this originally means. And throughout this, almost throughout Mark, I'm noticing, but especially through these chapters that we're studying today, you get this sense that God's view of things is so much different from ours, and ours should be his view, but we see it differently, and we take these things and we start making them into our own thing, whether it's a tradition or whether it's just our own desires and understanding. We do all these things like that. And so I'm loving that throughout this as we go through, how God is trying to change our perspective. It's like he's grabbing us and say, look over here. It's this, not this. Now, as we move on to Monday, we have clean hands or clean heart? And I'm thinking that's a trick question, isn't it? Seems to me like it's a trick question. I think it's important to have both clean hands and a clean heart. Now, of course, we have a kind of some people have germaphobe type aspect where they have to be overly clean. And interestingly enough, I think that kind of was something you could probably relate to the Jewish people at the time. Except that instead of being afraid of germs, they were afraid of spiritual germs.
It was fear-based and not faith-based. They were afraid of
Yes.
coming in contact that they would somehow not meet, and it was serious stuff. They would not meet God's approval if they were contaminated by all this unclean. And it's one of those things that you can have the right reasons and do exactly the wrong things.
Exactly.
From a human point of view.
Exactly. And that reminds me, again, in that verse I read in Isaiah 29, at the end it says, "And their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men." Again, it brings out that point. It's fear. The reason we do a lot of these things is fear. And fear is a selfishness. It is a selfish desire it's not wrong to sometimes fear if you're in danger and things like that, but at the same time, the reason you fear it is because you don't want to lose something. You don't want something taken away, or you want to gain something. And I think we're going to find that as we go along in this part about, let me find it here. Can someone read Mark 7, 14 through 13? No, 23, my bad. 7, 14 through 23. No, they got it. Thank you.
I forgot. And when he had called all the people unto him, he said unto them, Hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. If any man has ears to hear, let him hear. What's the end verse? What's the last verse?
To 23.
I'm sorry. And when he was entered into the house from the people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. And he said unto them, Are you so without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? But because it entered not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out in the draught, purging all meats. And he said, That which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed all evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, and murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, and evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile the man.
All right. So, right there, that last verse really kind of just sums this whole thing up. It's all the evil things that they were worried about. Everything that we're worried about, that comes from within. You can't even avoid it. There's no washing that away. There's no trying to stay away. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't actions you can do to avoid temptation and set yourself up for good situations. But they had this idea that basically if you touch the wrong person, as we studied a few weeks ago, like you said with that, and if you were in the wrong area, if you were doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, that made you somehow evil, wicked, that you had sinned. And so they turned sin into an avoidance of, I just have to stay away from sin, then I won't be a sinner. And Jesus is pointing out here that that's not possible, because the sin doesn't come from what's external. It comes from within. Now, it is interesting that some people will take this passage and basically start going with the idea that where it talks in Leviticus 11 about clean and unclean food, that, see, Jesus says right there, he says, that everything that goes inside becomes purified, so therefore I can eat whatever I want. Right? Isn't that what it says?
Yeah, and that's the traditional view of most churches.
Well, it's interesting because they're going to wash their hands after, getting in muck. So this is obviously talking about the type of cleanliness that is godlike, and the type of cleanliness that's just something you've set up as a tradition. Well, godlike would be to refrain from the foods that he told us not to eat, because he did that for health. It wasn't a ceremonial law, it was a health law. And to apply, okay, this health law was done away with because the ceremonial law that he's talking about and trying to put into focus is being misunderstood. They're just trying to convince themselves, those that want to eat the bad stuff, trying to convince themselves that what they're doing is okay.
Yes.
No matter what it does to your body. I have a close friend who's a Church of Christ pastor, that every time we'd go out to Denny's for breakfast, he'd order 2 orders of bacon and just stare at me while he was ordering it. And I said, you know what? Well, when you're in the hospital bed getting heart surgery, I will just say, I told you so. Well, he did end up in the hospital bed getting that type of surgery several years later. I did not tell him I told you so. He actually told me, yeah, you were right all along. I shouldn't have eaten all that bacon. But it's convincing ourselves that what we do or what we want to do is okay because this. They're twisting the words.
Yes, and that is one of the big keys I want to point out throughout this lesson is, again, and it's the starting out point that I was pointing out with those phrases and things where they sound like one thing, but they can actually mean something else. It is so important that when you go into a new situation especially, but even into dealing with people you know and things like that, it's important to let your mind be open to certain things. It doesn't mean you just accept everything, but you need to actually hear, just as Jesus keeps saying over and over, hear. Why aren't you hearing these things? Open your ears and hear. And it's important because there's different types of hearing. And there's so often where we come in with a preconceived notion of what something is. We just automatically want this. In fact, if you read about, I think it's in Matthew, it talks about mostly, but it's probably in Luke too, where it's Jesus' birth and that whole time period where the wise men are coming, and they go in and ask Herod and the Pharisees, where's the newborn? Where's this? And so they look it up, and it's interesting. It points out that their study of the scriptures is flawed because they came in with the desires of their own heart. They were reading the scriptures with the desire of their own heart in the way, and so that's the part you have to be open to. You don't have to be open to just any wild, crazy idea. You have to let your heart be open to God actually telling you something. And part of that means not going in with the idea that, well, I know this is exactly what the Bible means, and so now I'm going to prove it. Because you have now lost perspective. Now, Tuesday's lesson, crumbs for the dogs. We've had some pastors that have given some really good sermons here on that, and so I'm just going to read this real quick. From there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and wanted no one to know it. But he could not be hidden. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. And she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs. Then he said to her, for this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And when she had come to her house, she found the demon gone out and her daughter laying in the bed. Did Jesus just call this woman a dog? No, okay. So then what is this referring to? Again, this is where people can read one thing and not understand another if you're going in with a preconceived notion of what something is. So what is this talking about? Why is Jesus saying dog? Why is he referring to her this way that, I'm dealing with the children and, I can't throw stuff to the dogs.
Well, I like the way Shepherd described the situation because he said it goes first. And I hadn't really thought that deeply on that. I was more concerned about the dog's pets and looking at what the underlanguage was and,
Right.
doing all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like that.
Instead of just reading what it says. But he brings out it goes first, which left her with the understanding, oh, that's true. It goes first to the children, but it goes second to the pets. So maybe I can have because the dogs were pets. Anybody have a pet dog? The dogs were pets that were sitting under the table and in the room. These weren't just wild dogs or something. And so basically, if you want to think about it, you can take that word pets and put it in there. But the children get it first, but it's that word first
Oh,
that
yes.
gave her the hope that, well, he's trying to make a point here, and I'm a Gentile. I'm not a Jew, and these are all his apostles around, and he's trying to make a point here. But even I should get those leftover crumbs because even the pets get the leftover crumbs from the children. And that was such incredible faith, and that's what Shepherd points out in his lesson that I thought was really good.
I also think when he talks about crumbs, she was thinking just a little, She had the faith, it only had to be a tiny bit, and she'll be healed. So she was willing to settle for the crumbs. And then again, as you mentioned earlier,
Right.
little dogs at that time were household dogs, little tiny, and they were part of the family, Well, people have dogs, they're part of the family. And he was making a thing that even the crumbs is all I need.
Right.
Traditionally, the Jews consider the Gentiles as dogs also. And so Christ is using the same language as the Jews were doing. And at the same time, he's teaching his disciples not to call anyone unclean or dog. So he was indirectly actually teaching his disciples that they shouldn't consider anyone unclean, as Peter had to have this big dream that he had, that he shouldn't call anyone as something which is who is different.
Right. Yeah, those are all great points. I thank you. And it is really important, isn't it, to realize that for one thing, their way of talking is different from what we do. They had a different understanding. Their lifestyle, most people now, there's restaurants here in the United States where most places won't allow you to have a dog unless it's a very specific labeled dog for being a support animal. And, but back then there are different types of things. There were some that were pets and there's just different understandings. And it doesn't mean that we, it's no longer relevant to us. It just means we do need to take it in the context that it was given. And I do like that about the crumb too, because if you think about it, it not only shows her faith, but it shows how much she knew about God. Think about this. She knew that a crumb of what God could do, of what Jesus could do, a little itty bitty crumb that drops on the floor would be enough to fix her daughter's life. That's how much she knew the massiveness of God. A little bit of crumb could do a healing like that. And that is such an important aspect. And I think we see that in some of the other stories we've already read and the further ones too, where Jesus is pointing out their faith. The woman that was healed, what did she need to do? She didn't feel like he had to touch her or do anything fancy, any saying. She just had to touch the hem of his garment, had to just touch a little bit of him, and that would be enough. Again, our faith needs to be in what God can do, in the trustworthiness of God's ability. It's not how much you trust God to to want to help you. It's trusting God that he can help you even when you don't deserve it, even when you don't feel like it's yours. I mean, this woman is a perfect example of that with the dog. She is being subjected into a lower phase, and not changing her at all that way. She's like, yeah, that's my role. That's fine. I know you can still do it for me. Even though you're not supposed to, you're saying you're not supposed to, you're still God. I know you, you love me, you're going to do it.
I want to reinforce, though, Tess, I wanted to wait for you to see if you're going there, because in trying to teach the the apostles, that God was the Markan stories go through more often in one right after another, like you just said, than the other gospel stories, because he's showing that Christ, as the real Messiah, was there for all humanity, and that the Jewish people, the adoption of this clean and unclean was stopping. It was actually being a hindrance to the messiahship of Jesus, because his whole purpose was to bring the world together and to die for the world. And if you look at that as the common theme through the book of Mark, it's exactly what Tespa said. You know, this is a Gentile woman with incredibly great faith. The other was a Gentile woman with incredibly great faith, and yet he'd go to other cities, Nazareth and so forth, where they had no faith at all, and yet this was his people, his children.
Yes. As you know, it's God. You know, as much as he had a task to do, he helped the whole world. So, you know, just because you have priorities doesn't mean you stop doing anything else. And I think in some ways that shows what the Pharisees in Israel had turned into. They were doing the opposite of that. They were basically saying, you're either us or them. You're either holy or unclean, and you have to, make up your mind. You have to separate that way. You can't be, doing anything else. And Jesus is saying, look, I have a purpose to come, and it's for you, but it's also for them, and I'm going to help them as they come along. I'm going to do that too. So, I mean, we have to be open to this idea that, like, just because you have one purpose doesn't mean you don't have another purpose, that you don't have other things you can do. Because I've seen that happen. We get very focused. I know I can do that sometimes. If I got a task I'm working on really hard, it's got to be done. Someone comes up with something else, and I bark at them. I'm just like, ugh. I realize, they have something too. They have needs too, and it's important to, watch myself so that I don't get so focused on my goal, even if it's a good thing, which it kind of goes back to what Jesus was saying about what they were doing with honoring their father and mother. They were basically, changing it into, well, I'm doing this for God, so I can't do this for my mother. And this is another story of, well, just because you have something to do doesn't mean you don't also have another purpose and job to do as well. And one last little thing I want to point out, we had a pastor here, a guest speaker, about a year, maybe a year ago. He pointed out that the culture at the time, one of the things in that area was, for one thing, right now when we think of pets, we think of feeding them with dog food and things like that. You go to the store, you get the bag, and you scoop it out. And well, the food back then, they didn't have a grocery store like that for getting, pre-processed food. What you ate is also what animals ate. And so a lot of times, what was common in that culture is the father would sit there and, handing out the bread, and they would take and find out if all the kids are done eating, are there, anyone needing food, and if they're done, then he could take and wipe up the little bit of the gravy off of the plates onto the bread and give it to the dogs, because they needed to eat too. And so it's important to, again, have that context. So moving on, because we're running out of time here. Wednesday, tongue-tied. I'm going to read this. And again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, oh boy, Ephatha, I think something like that, Ephatha, that is, be opened. Obviously, I don't speak that natively. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Now this is a fascinating story. And we've already seen him do healings, some really major ones. So, back from death almost type stuff with the girl and things. So this shouldn't even be that surprising. And yet, in reading it, it's one of those that just hits you as soon as you start hearing about him sticking his fingers in his ear and spitting and putting on the tongue, right? And I think there's a lot to that can scare people a lot of times. They're like, well, why did he have to do that? Did he have to touch them? Was there something about it? What is it, right? Do we need to know even what the whole purpose would be of that? Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there a purpose why he had to do it that way compared to just the words or a hand on the shoulder or some other thing? Any thoughts? Nothing? I've heard a few different arguments for it. Perhaps that there was something that he did physically to help heal and things like that, or that it's symbolic, which I think that's a huge part of it. There is symbolism to it of fingers in the ears. It's showing how his hearing was stuck in the tongue. He needed to be loosed, and so Jesus provides his saliva to create, like a water flowing out of him in a way to kind of help everything start working again. It's interesting that in the Desire of Ages, page 404, Ellen White says about the sigh, because it says, that after he did those things, he looked up to heaven and sighed. And, sigh, like, yeah, another one of these stupid people I have to heal. No, that wasn't what he was doing. She says, he sighed at the thought of the ears that would not be open to truth, the tongues that refused to acknowledge the Redeemer. So, of course, again, so much of what Jesus did wasn't just singular about that person. There's meaning for us, meaning for his disciples, meaning for the people at the time, and meaning for that person. It could be that it meant something to have him touch that way and do things. There's always meaning to what Jesus does.
Well, I just wanted to add on what you said. I wanted to hear what everybody else thought about the touch and the saliva. But it probably was from Desire of Ages where I'm picking this up. But the actual way that we learn to hear is through his touch, through his presence, and through his speech. That's how we learn to speak the truth. And I love, again, how Shepherd, I'll have to read it, how Shepherd closed it out. What would you do with the gifts you have been given? What do you do with the gifts you have been given regarding hearing and speaking? For they are gifts.
Yes.
How are you using them? And I think that is exactly what Jesus is pointing out to those that watched him heal in this way. They all knew he could just speak the healing in. But by doing it physically, it reinforced to everybody around that hearing and speech come through and from him personally, his touch, who he is.
Yes.
And it's not just some magical, superstitious thing, I touched the hem of the garment type thing.
Right.
One other thing I would say,
Yes.
it's a little off the subject, but it was, I heard somebody speaking about that. I don't remember who it was, but he said that, look at all the miracles Jesus did. How many of them were as a result of somebody bringing the person to him? So it wasn't that Jesus went out and searched him out, but look at all of the miracles. And he was saying, does that give you an idea of what your job is? To bring people to Christ? And I think it's a very good point, and I never had thought of that.
Yeah, that is
how
very
many
good.
of the miracles were as a result of somebody, the people that dropped the guy through the ceiling, or brought people to Jesus. So many of them, about half of them.
Yes, and it's also something where people had to be willing, wanting. Zacchaeus, he wanted to see Jesus. The woman with the bleeding, she wanted to seek him out, and yet he also then put himself in just the right place to be there at the right time to be there. So he won't force you, but he is going to be right there if you're willing to call and ask for it. Just even, you don't even know you want it. You're not willing to talk to him like the woman. You don't want to talk, you just want to touch him. He's already there and knows. Now, there was one other thing I found kind of interesting. I don't know, with this idea of him touching. I mean, at the end it says that, what was that verse? Hang on. Verse 37. He said, they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. That part about doing all things well all of a sudden popped in my head as I was reading it, and I realized another time where things are well, done well, is that creation. In a sense, they're done good, they're done well. And it's kind of interesting that here is our Creator, Jesus, recreating this man in many ways, working on this man in a physical way as if he were over Adam, forming and changing and doing the things necessary. And so I think in some ways this shows his creatorship on this. It's not just him giving some magic phrase that, all of a sudden the person just gets well. This is the one who designed you actually going in and looking, and maybe that's part of the sigh too, is like, I designed this so much better, this isn't how it's supposed to be, And let me tweak that and add this and get some life back in that. He could understand it in ways we couldn't. But I think it's important to, think about the fact that God is our creator. Jesus is our creator there. And the things he's doing aren't just, things of, some supernatural things. This is our creator God, the one who actually designed us and wants us to be well. He's doing these things. Now, we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to really speed through this last one, but this is such a good one, so I'll have to push a little bit. Thursday, watch out for bad bread. Honestly, I was a little surprised that the lesson skipped over the first part of the chapter. I know time-wise probably was part of it. I was going to take time to read it, but we don't have time, so I'm going to also skip it. But I wanted to point it out because it's about the feeding of the 4,000. And again, we've just had similar stories, and we know the story. If you've been in church much, you've probably heard this story a lot. And it's just really interesting that way. But I think it actually is important to the rest of this lesson. That's why I really kind of wanted to include it if I could, because I think it flows into the next part that he actually does talk about in the lesson. Because when we move into the next part, let's read that. I'll read that first, and then we'll go back into that. So the Pharisees seek a sign. Oh, wait, I went too far. There we go. Chapter 8. That's it. 11. Okay, I'm sorry. 8, 11 through 13. I'll get it there. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit. Again, a sigh. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting into the boat, he departed to the other side. So, I'm just going to keep reading on, though, so we can get a little bit of the rest here. Verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves of the 5,000, for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls of fragments did you take up? And they said to him, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. So he said to them, how is it you do not understand? And I love the way Jesus does this. Again, he doesn't go into directly answering their question. Instead, he makes them think and learn and understand. I think it's interesting that their issue again, after just seeing Jesus feed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread and some fish, he does this again. This isn't the first time they've seen this. This is now the second time they have had something like this happen. And right after that, now they're going, Jesus is like, you guys better be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Like, oh, we don't have any bread. That's what he wants. Really? They had just seen Jesus make bread out of a little bread into, more than enough. Why would they think that Jesus was complaining about not having bread? I think it was partly because of their focus. They were so focused, again, their view was not what his view was. They were understanding things from their perspective. Bread again. In fact, honestly, I think that earlier story of the 4,000 is just, again, an example of them forgetting about the earlier one, feeding, with the 12 baskets full. They had just seen Jesus do that, and yet here they are, having to see it again, and then even again, they still don't get it. And so I think that's why I think that's important to have that story just in front of this, because it's showing how their understanding is different than God's. What God was wanting to do in that situation is provide, always provide. And so their worry shouldn't be about the things that are provided there, but the meaning and the reasoning and the purpose of what things are happening. Why are they happening? Why is he feeding these people? He had compassion on them. These type of things are the most important part of it. It's not that, they were hungry and here's some bread. That was a given. God was going to take care of them. God always takes care of us. He does what is needed for us. He'll do what's best. So our focus, the disciples' focus anyway, was so focused on this. Oh, he's still talking about bread. It must be bread. Now, that I think is why they thought it was, he was wanting literal bread. But I think it's interesting that it says they did not perceive, that Jesus, how Jesus describes it then. Because instead of, giving them a direct response of what the leaven means, he doesn't answer that really in this part. It's just, do you not perceive or understand? Your heart is hardened. You're not hearing. You're not seeing. And then it's followed by remember. And I like that one. That's one that hasn't. We've heard the hearing and the understanding and the seeing. But the remember is one that we haven't heard much yet until now, I think. And it's now that this remember comes into play. And that's such an important part, because that helps define what you're hearing and seeing. What is the purpose of hearing and seeing if you don't remember? If it's just, like my grandma used to love to say, it goes in one ear and out the other.
We have to remember that leaven the Jewish people were very used to the leaven being something more than just makes bread. I mean, every major holiday, they had to remove the leaven from their homes and these other things that were symbolic. And so for Christ to have used this symbol and them not get it and think it was physically bread he was talking about is astounding. You go, wow, if I had all those years of removing leaven on these major holidays, when he's talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, how could this have gone over their head and they think bread? But
exactly. And again, that goes into the earlier stories that they didn't remember. They had just been through one and they didn't remember it. They were worried about, we don't have enough bread. He wants bread. We should have brought some bread. They just saw him make a whole bunch of bread. Why would that be their first concern? Why is that their worry when he could make bread out of just about anything he wanted to, obviously? So that's part of it, is that remembering, but it also then starts with having a sympathetic heart. I think that's another part of it. It starts out with Jesus saying, how do you not, your heart, why is it hardened? How do you not see what I'm seeing? How are you missing the important part? You're seeing this issue of physical bread that I've got that covered. I've shown you that covered. Why aren't you worried about the serious aspect of spiritual safety and understanding? And so I love how Jesus ends it. He doesn't really even, he just says, how is it you do not understand? He adds it in a way that makes them have to question and come up with part of the answer. And that is in the idea that, you know, and they do understand it. If we later in Matthew 16:12, it kind of shows their understanding, because they understand that the leaven was now talking about the spiritual aspects of what the Pharisees were teaching, their doctrines. Now, one last thing I really want to cover quick here is the leaven, because that is a very interesting thing. Now, leaven is something that is used to ferment mostly. It basically changes the structure of whatever you have into something else, more flavor, gives it different things. There's actually many different types of leaven, baking soda and things like that, but this one was probably yeast. Now, do you know what yeast is? It's actually a living microorganism, and it plays two important roles in the process of bread making. It doesn't do it as fast as like baking soda and some, so there's different types of leavening agents, they call it. But what it does is it feeds on the sugars in the flour and releases carbon dioxide and ethanol that causes the dough to rise and expand. And that creates a lighter, softer, and airier texture with small bubbles, strengthens the dough, and then also, that helps allow to hold in the air. And it adds flavor then, because you have an organism that is processing sugar into the carbon dioxide and other stuff. So it's excreting one thing, it's eating one thing and excreting another. It changes what you're eating. That's why for fermenting alcohol, it changes it and adds a different flavor to it, and some other things. But I think it's interesting when we think about that, because what was it that the Pharisees were doing with the leaven? Why their leaven? What was it about their leaven? They were taking the Word of God, the bread that was perfect the way it was, and having the stuff, and they were basically taking the sweetness out of it, taking the things, the sugar, the important part of it, so that they could blow it up into something that seemed much more delightful in texture and different taste and easy to hand out. Here's this, you'll like this better. Here's how we do this. But it's filled with hot air, basically. Carbon dioxide, that's what we blow out. And that's what yeast does. It puts in carbon dioxide and ethanol. It just, they were blowing a lot of hot air into the traditions, into the teachings of God. And one last thing I wanted to add on that is that yeast growth is actually inhibited by both salt and sugar, but more so by salt than sugar. And I found that interesting, that salt especially is an inhibitor of yeast. We're told to be the salt of the earth. If you're giving the bread of life to, sharing it through you to others, if you have salt in you, you're going to be you're going to inhibit that chance, that desire to add that yeast. It's not even us, it's God in us, giving us that salt, making us so that we don't become like the Pharisees and start spouting a bunch of hot air. Right, we have to end here. I'm going to end with this quote from Ellen White. The religion of Christ is sincerity itself. Zeal for God's glory is the motive implanted by the Holy Spirit. And only the effectual working of the Spirit can implant this motive. Only the power of God can banish self-seeking and hypocrisy. This change is a sign of His working. When the faith we accept destroys selfishness and pretense, when it leads us to seek God's glory and not our own, we may know that it is of the right order. Father, glorify thy name was the keynote of Christ's life. And if we follow Him, this will be the keynote of our life. He commands us to walk even as He walked, and thereby we do know that we know Him, if we keep His commandments. That's Desire of Ages, page 409. I think that really sums it up well of what our purpose is with this and what this week's lesson has been about. It's about seeing life in a different way, and that way starts with Jesus. It starts with the Holy Spirit coming into your life. It's not just something you can take a book and study and go, oh, I found the way. This is God having to change you. It's the only way you're going to ever truly get the right motivation, because this is an inner thing again, inside out. Everything is coming from the inside. If you want to fix the sin in your life, you have to fix the inside. And that is something none of us can do. We can control the inside. We can try and monitor and repress. But the inside, to get down to the very part of it where everything starts, only our Creator can do that. And so he begs us, just open your ears, your eyes, see, hear, but to really see and hear. Don't just, I hear it and I'm going to take it my own way. Take it in, process it, and understand it from what God is saying, not from your perspective. Our own understanding can be a real big problem. Any last comments, or are we good? All right. Let's, actually, Richard, would you mind having a prayer for us?
Heavenly Father, again, we're thankful that we could be here this morning to study your word, to see these important lessons. You know, several of the parables here have a real important meaning for each and every one of us. May we think about them, may we absorb them into our lives, may we learn to listen better to God and to speak according to his will. But also may we listen to others and so we can understand them and reach out to them. For we ask in your name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Appreciated you here. And just stay online for our worship service. It'll be coming up real shortly. And then just pray the Spirit will be with us all and bless us as we hear the pastor speak. So thank you all.